All right, and we're back with the Craft versus Cruft Refactoring Challenge. I, as always, am your host, Ray Myers, and we are going to continue from Refactoring Challenge 1A, this trivia game that was submitted from a brave anonymous contributor. So, now if you don't recall this, it is a simple trivia game where you can answer these questions and it gives you a score at the end. Also gives you feedback on if you got the answer right or wrong. And we've put in some simple tests in the last episode using the Cypress framework, and very quickly we're able to add some basic cases on an end-to-end integration level that exercises the majority of the code base, which is the JavaScript portion, almost 200 lines. Guess what? We went from 0 tests to a pretty good exercising the app's functionality in probably 20 minutes of last episode. So I guarantee you do have time to introduce and improve your test coverage. And now that we have that, we can start to refactor with, I think, an acceptable level of confidence. So we can show you what this looks like if we open the Cypress tests here, and then we'll run them from the command line starting from there on. But this is actually going through and running these scenarios in an actual embedded web browser. This end-to-end stuff is normally at the top of the test pyramid. It's not your first recourse necessarily. Unit level tests that only test, isolated logic can be a lot better for your day-to-day. But starting at that more integration level can be a good way of introducing coverage when it was not already structured in a way that was particularly testable. And when you've got these DOM manipulations sprinkled throughout the code, that's a great example of where it's difficult to test in any other way. So this is a pretty effective approach for now. So shut down Cypress, and now I'm just going to run it at the command line. It assumes the existence of a server that's already running, but we could fairly easily make a live server, start it up, and then shut down over the course of running this from the command line. And once we get this into like a continuous integration server, that'd be how we'd want to handle that. Something else we put in as far as checks go, and I'm going to go ahead and put Cypress run into the test scripts. Now we'll run it with npm test instead of run. We also installed a linter. So let's look at the errors the linter surface. Let's go ahead and address those. Container is assigned to a value but never used. Okay, so we've got some unused code here. Looks like containers used in a lot of subsections here, but I can use a word break to search for a container only as a whole word, and I can see, yep, indeed, this is the only time that's used. Answer is assigned to a value but never used as well. All right, great. Answer equals 0. So I believe that would be the time. And perhaps this also. Yeah, so it's just set twice and then never addressed, so that's not useful. Interval is used and never defined. So this, I think, is this display timer situation, and we discovered last time that actually that never does anything. We never see this timer, so I think that was a half implemented feature. What do we do with code that's not actually being used? We just we take that right out. Let's not leave it commented out. It's in version control. We can go back if we need it, but if we've got code that's not doing anything, just take that right out. You see this in production code all the time, as things are left in just in case. Let's not do that. So great. Let's run this again. Second is now assigned to, okay, that I didn't delete every part of this. Linter now runs clean, great. So that pulled its weight right off the gate, gave us some good suggestions. And if we run the tests, hopefully they still pass. Great, so right now I'm going to commit. Make some nice small commits so I can always go back if I make a misstep somewhere. Whether you want to rebase them later or not is up to you. I like the very fine grain commits as we go. As soon as you've made a significant change and test pass, go ahead. So I mentioned before we see a lot of comments here, but the comments are sort of just saying what the next line of the code is doing. And I think it's a good idea to get in the habit of not so much commenting what, not in the trivial cases, but comment why, if you're doing something unusual especially. But if you're just saying, you know, the next line of code we select the question container, I think in this case the code's quite clear. You know, the variable is called question container, and you're doing a selecty thing there. So I don't think that necessarily adds any value. I think the code's very clear as it stands. A lot of programs, I think, teach you to do it this way, but my school of thought is very much in the make the code the most legible thing, because comments can fall out of date and ultimately distract from what the code's really doing over time and as things are really being maintained. Now this one's a little more interesting. I won't say that this 100% communicates the same as the code because it's called selected option here, but we're selecting all inputs with option name here. So is it the selected one or is it all radio buttons? I'm not sure, but I think I'm gonna believe the comment here and just say, why don't we call it that? Why don't we, if this is all radio buttons, if that's the best thing we can call it, then let's call it that. And now I think that is perfectly clear as it can be. And this next button equals that, so I agree with the choice not to comment that. I think that's very clear. Select result container. Well, it's called result. Really, there's a convention here that the result would be the data, like question might be the data. The DOM element that it goes into, we're calling like its container. So I think it might be appropriate to say this variable is going to be the result container. I'm just noticing a convention that's already in the code and then following it. It looks like the rename did apply it. Got to be careful if we're in JavaScript and not something like Java, that the automated refactors are actually doing the right thing. But looks like it did here, especially in just one file. So it looks like we have a family of initialization stuff that we could conceptually group. I'm not sure that this actually communicates anything because obviously you're setting it to 0. So what we might do if we wanted to add some information is group this into an init method, but I don't think this one actually adds anything. So select message. I think same as before, we might call this a message container, but the code itself is quite clear. So I'm going to just do a rename on that. I think that got everything. Let's make sure our tests are still running. Great. So we can review the diffs and just go ahead and commit that we did some renames. So as I say, now that comment 2 is not needed. So this said write a function to display questions. Well, of course we're writing a function. That seems like it's more of a to-do item, but display questions. That's an interesting point here, right? The function's called getQuestion. That would imply that it has no side effects. By convention of command query separation, you either want to make the effect that you're getting a value or that you're performing an action. There are some exceptions to this, but I think that's a nice practice. If a function is ever labeled get something, that puts it firmly into the query and not command category of command query separation. Is very passive. But if it's displaying something, well, that's a side effect. That's doing something in the world. That's launch the missiles. And it looks like this is actually a command, not a query, right? Because it is interfering with the world in these ways. It's setting the text content on the question container. And I've actually seen this kind of scenario in production code where things that were called get such and such actually perform some side effect. And I've seen some fairly subtle bugs that have resulted on then people making assumptions about what was happening when they called that method. So I think what the comment says is pretty good, right? It's a display question. Let's call it that. Make sure we've not broken anything. All right. After this comment, it's not clear to me what it actually intends because it's talking about random options, but I don't see any randomizing happening here. So I suspect that this was in reference to something that was intended at some point but never completed, which is one of the classic problems you see with comments is they kind of drift from what's happening in the code. So rather than try to figure out what that should actually say, I'm just going to say that that's not accurate. Let's take it out. But I think it's pretty clear as is. We've got the current question index. We look it up and we get the option out from there. I actually think that options would be a slightly better name, right? Because it is an array, but we can get to that. You may notice I'm very persnickety about naming. Like, how can we make the names just the most obviously corresponding to what they are? Because that just it makes a big deal on maintenance and debugability. Now let's look at this one. For each input, display questions. That actually, I might put it down here, but it does seem to be adding a little bit because I don't immediately look at this code, obviously for each input, but display questions doesn't really capture that. So let's leave it, but we might be able to come back and get rid of it in a moment. Now set the radio button check value. What does that add? Well, it lets us know that this input is a radio button. Other than that, we're setting its value. So if that's not obvious, and I admit it, it might not be, perhaps we just call it that. Radio button option, radio option, whatever you want to call it. We reset its value. I think it's clear that that's what's happening. Checked equals false. Display the options text. Now you might say, Ray, this definitely is something that we need that comment there because it's got this next element sibling and so on and so forth. So we absolutely need this comment. Well, as it's structured right now, we do. But I think it might be even better to extract this into a function and say, just this is a real simple one, might not be the best possible name out the gate, but just display options text. If that's what we're doing, then let's create something that does that. And we have some text and a radio button that we take, and we're calling it for a side effect. So we will not return a value or use a return value. And then we just pass in our radio button and our answer. Make it a little bit more context independent. Display question option text. Sure, a little wordy, but it's complete. If we come up with a better name later, we can do that. So now that comment is no more as well. Make sure our test will pass. And arguably this one isn't needed either. 9 times out of 10, the way I would obviate the need for a comment is one of those two things. I'm either renaming a variable or I'm extracting a method. Incidentally, we got a console log in here. That's not necessary. We'll just take that out. So what next? Add event listener to next button? I think it's very clear again that that's what's happening. Handle next question. I think that is a good name for this. It's very much in the convention of you're putting a click action on something. You could also call it next question button clicked or something. Those are the two ways you see this, but I think that's a good name. All right, provide condition to correct answer. I'm not entirely sure what that's intending to communicate, but I can see we're looking for the checked button here. We're selecting it. So let's just call that something even more specific than select answer. I think that would be the checked radio button. And then the selected answer is that thing's value, let's say. And then I think it's pretty clear what's going on. So update number of correctly answered questions. That looks to be some code that was there formerly and not anymore. So as I mentioned before, what do we do with commented out code? Just get it right out of there. It's in version control if we need it. Now this does, I think, capture some knowledge here, right? We're updating our score ultimately with this conditional. So what I'm actually going to do is I'll say that is a conceptual grouping that does exactly that thing, right? It updates the score. Now, I'm not in love with the fact that it's manipulating globals in order to do that, but that's something we can deal with later, right? Let's just say what we want to do is update score. And throw that in there. Perhaps we first want to extract this guy into a variable and say that this is the correct answer. There we go. If select answer is correct answer, cool. And then into that we will pass selected answer and correct answer. Now, this comment did add value, but now the structure of the methods and variables communicates that same information in a way that won't be lost accidentally as the code updates. It'll be much more likely to continue being correct. And the test will pass. Now this next question thing, you could go back and forth about whether it's useful to define a next question method just to increment this thing, or whether incrementing it is pretty clear you're going to the next question. If this had a side effect, if there's something you needed to call after doing next question, like if we're going to say that this is part of going to the next question, for example, then you might have a case there. Let's say that it is. We'll see what that looks like. You know, you don't always get it right your first try. So, and to make it absolutely clear that we're not like getting it, we're actually going to, I'm going to name it kind of verbosely out the gate here. Advance to next question. Next question would probably be fine too. Now, does that depend on anything? No, it's all strictly globals, which, as I say, is not great, but it does mean it's very easy to do this, to extract it as the method there. So we could push this down an abstraction level as well. Result container inner HTML score equals, perhaps we just have display score. You can pass it a score. Score is global, you could pass it to. There's a lot of ambiguity in like, where is the data coming from? What are the inputs and outputs at different spots when this is all global? And if we were going to continue down the refactoring path, that's something that we'd want to address. And we're displaying the score here too, but it's in a different context because we're actually setting the entire body, which is a little strange, but whatever, to be that. So let's call that, we're displaying the score at end of game. Display final score, let's say. And that's going to do it a little differently. And that restart comment, that's, I think, meaningful. That restart comment, I think, is a little bit meaningful. So let's make that a verb as well, perhaps. Now we had, I think we set that one other time, did we not? At the beginning of everything is current question index became 0, score became 0. I think we could make that a thing we do when we restart. And then have a single call to restart here, for instance, and make that the initialization. All right, we've got our first red. Where have I gone wrong here? Reading property option of undefined. So I kind of put the cart before the horse, I'm guessing, and some of these display question being called, for instance, before restart. So let's say that let's put there. Because I had set that index, I had avoided setting it outside the restart method, and so I was trying to go to it couldn't go to index 0 because the current question index hadn't been set yet, if it wasn't clear what was happening there. So what I've done here is a little bit interesting. I would argue that this is a more readable code than it was before, but mostly what I've done here is remove comments. And so you might think, but aren't comments good? Don't they help the code be readable? They can. They're a good tool. When clear names and short single concern functions and methods are a way of expressing the same thing that a comment would, I don't always reach for a comment first. I think that oftentimes a comment is just me not knowing how to make the code clear. Now, would I say, okay, this has now got the right amount of comments in it now that it's got 0? Not necessarily. I would perhaps look at swaths of the code and say, how do I lay out what this intent is, what's gonna happen, what the strategy is here. And I would look for things that are a little more subtle, where I could use comments in a way that was more helpful. So we're green tests. We go ahead and commit that. Something else I'm curious about is all these lets. I mentioned it's good that they're lets, not vars, but I wonder if some of them could be consts that aren't yet. All these ones that are getting elements, for example, from the DOM, that I think is a case where we don't have to use let. So let's give that a try. As many consts as possible I like to do. Less state changing, the less chance there is for a bug that's the result of a state change. Great, so there's a lot of directions we could go now. I've mentioned several times that we're playing around in the global scope, and we could reduce that. An even lower hanging fruit might be this this questions. Is I like that it's data driven, but I would like to just move it to a separate file. So let's go ahead and do that. And while we're at it, I'm noticing this quiz 1 probably intends just to be named quiz right now. There's not a quiz 2, so let's not imply the existence of such a thing. We're going to have to change the include to do that. So I'm going to make for now a questions.js, and we'll pull this in. You might want to be able at some point to have, multiple sets of questions that you can select between and drop them into this, but we're not supporting that right now. This maybe arguably gets us a little closer to that. So we could actually use imports here. I might fumble around a little bit trying to make that work because we're not in a context with an asset pipeline and things, so I'm not going to jump to that right now. But I just wanted to call out that was arguably a more correct way of doing it. I'm just going to import them both in what I happen to know is the right order here. That's not particularly scalable. All right. And it's not a let, it's a const, remember. Run our formatter. So now the business part of this, the part where most of the code logic is just 80 lines, many of which are blank, and before it was approaching 200. So splitting that up certainly very useful for just our navigation purposes, I think. What might we do next? Well, this is where I've mentioned before we've got a separation of concerns issue as far as logic about the game muddled in with DOM manipulation. And so that's where we could start to pull out the DOM manipulation into separate code. And then we've also got things done on the global scope, and that would be a problem as the code base matures. So those are things we could look at. And that's a great example of why you see people say things like unit testing or test-driven development drives a good design of code, right? Is oftentimes if design isn't super suitable for unit testing, then it's not modular in other ways that support a healthy and maintainable code base. You can see that illustrated beautifully in the book, I believe, called Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests, which of course I will link in the description. You can check out both the original code in main branch and the refactored code that we're working with here in the Git repo in the description as well. I think we've got about enough for today. If you've got some code you'd like to see refactored up here, please reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Always remember what Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching, with patience the most tangled cord may be undone. Thank you.